I sit here in the sovereign archive beneath the green glow of a banker's lamp. In the year 1908, a single automobile cost nearly $3,000. That equaled 2 full years of income for an average worker. By 1924, that exact same vehicle cost just $260. Mainstream history claims this was merely a triumph of mechanical engineering. What nobody knew at the time was that this drop was a cold financial re-engineering of human labor. History is not driven by noble speeches or brilliant inventors. It is governed by debt balances, velocity of capital, and resource control. This is the hidden financial history of the assembly line. It is the invention that made everything cheap. At the dawn of the 20th century, global industry faced a quiet capital crisis. Manufacturing was slow, expensive, and chaotic. Skilled artisans assembled goods piece by piece. Every bolt was filed by hand. Every engine block required custom fitting. If a part broke, a machinist had to forge a unique replacement. Because of this, factories produced tiny volumes at exorbitant prices. Only the wealthy aristocracy could afford manufactured luxury items. Most citizens lived in a world of handmade scarcity. Wall Street financiers looked at this setup with growing impatience. Banking cartels had poured hundreds of millions of gold-backed dollars into heavy industry. Yet their returns were choked by the slow physical speed of production. Capital needs rapid movement to generate compound interest. When raw iron ore sat in a warehouse for months, it was dead money. When an unfinished carriage occupied factory floor space for weeks, it drained corporate liquidity. Powerful banking houses led by figures like J.P. Morgan attempted to solve this through industrial trusts. They consolidated steel mills, coal mines, and locomotive works into massive monopolies. They controlled prices and crushed competing smaller firms. Yet consolidation could not fix the fundamental physical bottleneck inside the workshop. Human hands still moved too slowly. Skilled workers controlled the pace of labor. They took breaks, demanded higher wages, and went on strike when threatened. Here's the thing most people don't realize. Artisan labor was a direct threat to high-finance banking profits. If workers controlled the time required to build a product, they controlled the balance sheet. Financiers could not accurately predict quarterly earnings or standardize yield on invested capital. They needed a mechanism to remove human discretion from the production floor. They needed a system where capital dictated the exact speed of human muscle. In 1908, the automotive sector showcased this systemic weakness at its absolute worst. Building a single automobile required over 12 hours of continuous skilled labor. Mechanics walked back and forth across vast rooms to gather tools and components. They lost thousands of hours every week just walking across wooden factory floors. This inefficiency forced companies to demand massive upfront cash deposits from buyers. Customers had to pay months before receiving their vehicles. Automobile manufacturing was essentially a custom boutique service for millionaires. Henry Ford hated this dependence on Wall Street capital. He wanted to bypass the big investment banks entirely. To do that, he needed an explosive increase in production volume. Volume would generate immediate internal cash flow. Cash flow would free him from taking high-interest loans from New York financiers. He gathered a small group of ambitious engineers at his Highland Park facility in Michigan. They began dissecting every single movement required to build a machine. They found their crucial inspiration in an unexpected place. Engineers visited the massive industrial meatpacking plants of Chicago. There, they watched cows suspended on overhead monorails moving past line workers. Each butcher stood in one place and performed a single specific cut. The animal moved, while the human remained motionless. The engineers realized they had been looking at manufacturing backward. For centuries, workers moved around the product. To unlock massive capital velocity, the product had to move past stationary workers. They decided to invert the physical mechanics of the factory floor. They began experimenting with ropes, pulleys, and gravity slides in 1913. The initial tests focused on assembling a simple flywheel magneto. Under the old craft system, a single mechanic built one magneto in 20 minutes. That equaled 3 units per hour per worker. Ford's team broke the assembly down into 29 separate operations. They placed a moving conveyor belt between the workers. Each man performed only one mechanical step before the part moved to the next station. Within weeks, the time required to assemble a magneto plunged to 5 minutes. That was an immediate production increase of over 300%. Think about that for a second. A simple mechanical belt instantly quadrupled the productive capacity of human labor. The engineers immediately applied this moving concept to the entire automobile chassis. In August 1913, a rope pulled a frame across a 200-foot factory floor. Machinery rolled alongside it while workers attached parts. Assembly time dropped from 12.5 hours down to 6 hours. By December, they installed motorized endless chain drives beneath the floorboards. Assembly time dropped further to 91 minutes per vehicle. By 1914, Highland Park was pumping out a complete automobile every 49 seconds. The physical velocity of capital had been unlocked. Raw steel entered the plant gates and emerged as a saleable asset in hours. The immediate financial consequences were staggering. Fixed overhead costs were spread across hundreds of thousands of manufactured units. The unit production cost plunged straight down a cliff. In 1910, Ford sold his flagship Model T for $900. By 1916, he reduced the price to $345. By the mid-1920s, the price dropped to just $260. Competitors who relied on traditional manufacturing methods were instantly crushed. Hundreds of smaller automobile firms collapsed into bankruptcy or were bought for pennies. Mass production began concentrating industrial power into a tiny handful of colossal corporate monopolies. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. The assembly line created a terrifying human crisis behind factory walls. While the physical output skyrocketed, the human element began to break down completely under the relentless pace. Moving belts converted human workers into biological cogs inside a giant machine. Workers no longer took pride in crafting an entire machine. They turned the exact same bolt 8,000 times per shift. The mental monotony was completely maddening. Men suffered severe physical fatigue, nervous breakdowns, and painful repetitive motion injuries. The factory floor turned into a noisy, high-pressure industrial prison where talking was forbidden. By late 1913, Highland Park was suffering from a catastrophic labor collapse. The annual worker turnover rate hit an unbelievable 370%. To maintain a steady workforce of 13,000 men, Ford had to hire 52,000 workers every year. Men worked for 2 days, received their pay, and simply walked away. They refused to return to the relentless rhythm of the moving line. Daily absenteeism hovered around 10%. Production lines frequently stalled because key assembly positions sat completely vacant. The massive financial gains of the moving line were about to be erased by human flight. Wall Street analysts predicted Ford's radical new system would crash under its own weight. High worker turnover threatened to strangle the company's record cash flows. Ford needed a drastic financial mechanism to lock workers to their assembly stations permanently. On January 5, 1914, he announced a policy that shocked the entire financial world. He doubled factory wages overnight from $2.30 to $5 a day. He also reduced the daily work shift from 9 hours down to 8. Foreign newspapers hailed Ford as a benevolent saint and a champion of the working class. Follow the money. The $5 day was not an act of human kindness or corporate charity. It was a cold, calculated economic mechanism designed to enforce total labor discipline. First, the full $5 payout was split into 2 distinct financial categories. Half was standard daily wage, while the other half was a conditional profit-sharing bonus. To qualify for that bonus, workers had to submit to terrifying personal surveillance. Ford established a dedicated internal intelligence unit known as the Sociological Department. Over 100 corporate investigators invaded the private homes of factory workers without warning. They inspected personal cleanliness, bank account balances, marital stability, and drinking habits. If a worker gambled, drank alcohol, harbored boarders, or unionized, his daily bonus was instantly revoked. Immigrant workers were forced to attend corporate Americanization classes and speak only English. And no, I'm not making that up. Ford created a corporate surveillance state to protect his factory's output. The financial incentive worked with terrifying precision. Thousands of desperate men flooded Detroit from across the globe to secure these high-paying jobs. Police had to use fire hoses to disperse cold, angry job seekers outside the factory gates. Turnover instantly evaporated from 370% down to less than 1%. Absenteeism plummeted to virtually zero. The $5 wage achieved something far more profound than labor retention. It solved a massive macroeconomic paradox that had haunted industrial capitalism for decades. Historically, industrial capitalism kept worker wages as low as possible to maximize corporate profits. But low wages meant workers could never afford to buy the products they manufactured. Factories suffered constant crises of overproduction because the general public lacked real purchasing power. By paying workers $5 a day, Ford created a new social class. His workers earned enough cash to purchase the very automobiles they were assembling. The factory worker became the primary consumer. This established the self-reinforcing financial flywheel of modern mass consumerism. Higher wages created mass domestic demand. Mass demand justified larger assembly factories. Larger factories reduced unit costs through extreme economies of scale. Lower unit costs yielded massive corporate profits, which funded even higher wages and cheaper prices. Capital had found a way to recycle wages directly back into corporate balance sheets. Money paid out on Friday returned to company bank accounts by Monday morning. But this internal monetary cycle soon faced a major physical limitation. Even with $5 daily wages, cash savings could not absorb the millions of cheap products flooding off assembly lines. To keep assembly lines moving 24 hours a day, industry required an even more powerful monetary tool. That tool was consumer credit. Prior to the 1920s, personal debt was viewed as a shameful moral failing. Borrowing money for non-essential consumer goods was considered reckless financial behavior. Banking institutions catered primarily to corporate clients, land purchases, and commercial trade. But mass production generated such a massive torrent of consumer goods that traditional cash sales were simply insufficient. Production capacity was outstripping available physical money. In 1919, General Motors established the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, known as GMAC. It was designed to revolutionize personal consumer finance. GMAC allowed average working families to buy an automobile by paying a small cash down payment. They financed the rest through monthly installment payments with high interest rates. Instead of saving cash for 3 years to buy a vehicle, consumers drove home today and pledged their future wages as collateral. Ford initially resisted installment selling, believing in hard cash savings. But GMAC's installment scheme allowed General Motors to rapidly steal massive market share from Ford. Ford was forced to capitulate and establish his own consumer financing operations. Within a few short years, over 70% of all automobiles sold in America were bought on credit. The financial architecture of the nation shifted from a culture of thrift to a culture of permanent debt obligations. Mass production had successfully transformed the citizen into an indebted consumer unit. Debt became the indispensable fuel required to keep assembly line conveyor belts turning. I sit here behind my desk in the Sovereign Archive under this green banker's lamp. Look closely at the corporate ledgers from this era. By 1925, mass production had generated unprecedented corporate dividends. Yet real wages were already beginning to plateau while industrial output soared exponentially. The entire economic expansion of the 1920s was being sustained by an unprecedented mountain of consumer debt. Corporate boardrooms celebrated record earnings, while central banks expanded paper credit. If you want to decode the hidden financial architecture of history, hit the subscribe button right now. Together, we will continue pulling back the curtain on the secret monetary forces shaping our world. The assembly line model did not remain confined to automobile factories in Michigan. It rapidly invaded every single sector of the global industrial economy. Manufacturers applied moving conveyor logic to household appliances, radios, clothing, furniture, and processed foods. Meat processing, steel production, and electrical manufacturing were completely overhauled. The physical world was being standardized to fit the uniform demands of mass assembly. Screws, threads, voltages, and sheet metal gauges were universally standardized by international corporate agreements. Standardization drastically reduced manufacturing costs while creating massive structural barriers to entry for smaller competitors. Mass production also triggered a massive industrial race for raw material resources across the globe. Assembly lines consumed staggering quantities of raw rubber, crude oil, iron ore, copper, and glass. A single disruption in the supply of raw rubber from Southeast Asia could freeze giant factories in Detroit. To secure uninterrupted streams of raw materials, industrial corporations built giant international supply monopolies. They secured rubber plantations, oil fields, and mining concessions through aggressive financial leverage and diplomatic pressure. Henry Ford attempted one of the most absurd vertical integration projects in financial history. He purchased thousands of square miles of Brazilian rainforest to build his own captive rubber empire. He named this isolated company town Fordlandia. He spent tens of millions of dollars trying to impose Midwestern assembly line discipline on the Amazon jungle. He constructed American-style suburban houses, paved roads, and strict work schedules for local indigenous workers. He forced workers to eat cafeteria food and attend square dances in 90-degree tropical heat. Fordlandia turned into a catastrophic operational and financial nightmare. Tropical blights systematically destroyed the rubber trees planted in unnatural, rigid grid rows. Local workers revolted against strict corporate surveillance and foreign dietary rules. Ford poured millions into the jungle without ever producing a single drop of usable commercial rubber for his assembly lines. The project demonstrated the ultimate arrogance of mass production logic. Engineers believed they could force living biological ecosystems to conform to the rigid linear schedules of a factory floor. While Fordlandia failed, the relentless demand for resources reshaped global trade balances permanently. Nations possessing massive reserves of oil, iron, and rubber became strategic focal points for international finance. Industrialized nations used sovereign debt, unequal trade pacts, and military presence to guarantee cheap resource flows. The assembly line was no longer just a mechanical arrangement inside a building. It had evolved into a complex, fragile global web of resource extraction. During the 1920s, this massive surge in manufacturing efficiency created a deadly economic illusion. The United States produced more goods than the rest of the industrialized world combined. Mainstream economists declared that poverty had been permanently eradicated by modern industrial organization. Stock market valuations soared to astronomical heights as investors bought shares in mass production corporations. Central banks kept interest rates low, encouraging commercial banks to issue massive amounts of margin credit. Investors used borrowed money to buy corporate stocks, betting that factory earnings would grow infinitely. Underneath this glittering surface, a fatal macroeconomic imbalance was quietly festering. Mass production lines were pumping out physical goods at an exponential rate. But real consumer wages were not keeping pace with this explosion of physical supply. The public had stretched its borrowing capacity to the absolute maximum limit. Working families were carrying multiple installment loans for their cars, radios, furniture, and homes. By 1929, the average American household was spending a huge portion of its monthly income purely servicing interest on existing debt. The consumer market hit a hard saturation point. People simply could not take on any more loans to buy additional products. Warehouse inventory began piling up to the rafters at factories across America. Unsold automobiles stacked up in corporate storage lots by the tens of thousands. When factory managers saw unsold inventory rising, they made the only logical business decision. They shut down assembly lines and laid off hundreds of thousands of workers. These mass layoffs triggered a terrifying financial feedback loop across the entire economy. Fired workers could no longer pay their monthly credit installments to finance companies and banks. Non-performing consumer loans overwhelmed local banking institutions, causing widespread bank runs and failures. As banks collapsed, credit froze completely. Without access to fresh consumer credit, demand for manufactured goods suffered a complete systemic collapse. the hyper-efficient mass production engine slammed into a brick wall of debt deflation. The Great Crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression were not random accidents of nature. They were the direct consequence of a fundamental structural flaw in early mass production logic. Hyper-efficient supply chains had outstripped the financial mechanism used to distribute purchasing power. Capital had optimized the physical speed of manufacturing while over-leveraging the balance sheets of the working class. When the debt bubble burst, the global economy plunged into a decade of horrific poverty and social devastation. Despite the economic devastation of the Great Depression, the underlying financial logic of mass production did not die. Instead, state governments stepped in to absorb and manage the systemic risks. During World War II, the assembly line model was weaponized on an unprecedented global scale. Governments took direct control of industrial allocation, converting consumer factories into war production engines. Ford's Willow Run facility manufactured a complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 59 minutes on a mile-long moving line. The military-industrial complex was born directly from the mechanics of Highland Park. After the war, the United States used the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement to export this mass-production economic model globally. The U.S. dollar was established as the world's primary reserve currency, backed by gold. American factories supplied a devastated world with cheap, mass-produced consumer goods. American corporate finance extended massive sovereign reconstruction loans, such as the Marshall Plan, to European nations. These international loans were explicitly tied to buying American industrial machinery and manufactured exports. In the post-war decades, Western economies experienced an unprecedented consumer boom. The assembly line model evolved into its next financial iteration: planned obsolescence. Corporate engineers deliberately design products to break down, wear out, or become fashionably outdated after a fixed number of years. If consumer goods lasted indefinitely, assembly lines would eventually run out of buyers. By engineering artificial product lifespans, corporations guaranteed a permanent, perpetual cycle of consumer replacement demand. Waste became a deliberate, profitable feature of corporate balance sheets. By the 1970s, Western industrial nations faced another severe profit squeeze. High domestic wages, strong labor unions, and rising environmental regulations were eating into corporate profit margins. Furthermore, the suspension of the gold standard in 1971 completely untethered global finance from physical currency constraints. Fiat currency expanded rapidly, driving inflation higher. To maintain high corporate profit margins, global industrial cartels executed a massive geographic migration of their production lines. Corporations broke apart their centralized megafactories and offshored individual assembly steps to developing nations. They moved labor-intensive operations to countries with low wages, weak labor laws, and zero environmental regulations. The assembly line was expanded across oceans. Raw materials were mined in Africa, processed in South America, assembled into components in Southeast Asia, and shipped to China for final assembly. Finished goods were then loaded onto massive container ships and sent to Western markets. This globalized assembly system relied on a new industrial philosophy known as just-in-time manufacturing. Pioneered by Toyota in Japan, just-in-time eliminated costly warehouse storage of raw materials and spare components. Computerized tracking systems ensured that parts arrived at factory gates precisely when needed on the assembly floor. This freed up billions of dollars in corporate capital that had previously been tied up in static inventory. Corporate liquidity skyrocketed, driving stock valuations and executive bonuses to unprecedented records. However, this hyper-lean global assembly line introduced unprecedented fragility into the international economic order. By stripping out physical inventory buffers and redundancy, global supply chains became vulnerable to catastrophic disruption. A single maritime bottleneck, a geopolitical conflict, or a regional pandemic could freeze production lines across the entire planet. What was designed as the ultimate liquid financial efficiency turned into a fragile house of cards. Consider the modern reality of global consumerism in the year 2026. Almost every cheap item in your home exists because of this century-old financial machinery. Your smartphone, television, clothing, and furniture are physical manifestations of hyper-leveraged global debt and ultra-optimized labor arbitrage. Western economies no longer manufacture physical goods at scale. Instead, they manufacture complex financial instruments, sovereign debt, and digital consumer credit to keep buying cheap imported goods. The fundamental logic of Henry Ford's assembly line has now transcended the physical factory floor entirely. Today, technology conglomerates apply moving assembly line mechanics directly to human cognition and digital data. Algorithmic feeds process human attention, breaking down digital interaction into discrete, trackable, monetizable data points. Humans have transitioned from assembly line workers to the very raw material being processed by digital algorithms. We are trapped in a perpetual digital loop, constantly consuming products financed by perpetual debt obligations. The promise of mass production was that cheap goods would liberate humanity from physical scarcity and backbreaking toil. But cheap physical goods turned out to be a Trojan horse for a sophisticated financial control system. It created a world dependent on endless resource extraction, constant wage stagnation, infinite credit growth, and fragile global supply networks. The true cost of making everything cheap was never eliminated. It was simply shifted onto balance sheets, offshored to invisible foreign labor markets, and kicked down the road as sovereign debt for future generations to pay. I close this vintage ledger and dim the lamp inside the sovereign archive. The high-speed assembly lines of 1913 transformed into the global debt balance sheets of today. If this deep dive opened your eyes, leave a dollar symbol in the comments, subscribe, and click the video on screen now to uncover the next secret financial mechanism driving history.